Hey everyone, and welcome to our April live event with National Sewing Circle. Once again, we have Nicki LaFoille back, who's going to answer all of your sewing questions. So thanks for being here, Nicki.
Hi, I'm glad to be here.
Of course. Well, so if this is your first live event that you're watching, what's going to happen is over the next hour, you can ask any sewing related question to Nicki, and she'll do her best to answer as many of them as possible. And you can ask those by putting them into the chat box on the page that you are currently viewing this video on. And so we're going to start off with a question that's going to go along with something that you may have watched if you're a member of National Sewing Circle and saw one of Nicki's previous events where she made a pillow with some piping. So talk a little bit about piping and how you make it, because I'm curious to know if we make it the same way, and sort of the techniques and things that need to go into making this fun trim that you can add to pretty much any project.
Yeah, definitely. So piping, you can buy it pre-made, but I'm a huge proponent of making your own because then you can get exactly the fabric that you want on this trim. So piping is it's this rope sort of cord inside wrapped with a bias strip. So you have your seam allowance here that you can then attach it wherever you want along. I made a pillow the other day as a Gold Live event. So I attached my piping around the edge, the perimeter of a pillow. So, you sandwich your seam allowances in, matching the raw edges, and it's this cute little three-dimensional trim along the edge of your pillow. But to make this, you need your filler cord, and which come in all kinds of different sizes. So it's a 3/4 inch circumference. So I think it was like a 1/4 inch diameter. And when you see a number like that on either a package of filler cord or a package of pre-made piping, or on the bolt, because sometimes this will it'll come in packages sometimes, or it'll come on the bolt, like in the trim section. So the number that you see on it is typically referring to the diameter. So this, you can see how much thinner that stuff was than this. This was an 1/8 inch diameter, so it was a lot thinner than this stuff. So you can get the filler cord in a bunch of different sizes. And the circumference of the cord, you need to know that because you need to know how wide to cut your bias strip to wrap around. So you need, double your seam allowance width plus the circumference of the cord, and that's the width that you need to cut your bias strips. And I like to make my piping by laying down my cord, my filler cord in the middle, and you match your raw edges. And I like to baste that cording in to my piping. And then when I put it on my edge that I'm piping, so when I laid it on the edge of the pillow, there are some people who like to just lay down all of their layers and stitch it, bam, and they're done. But I like to baste my piping down onto the perimeter of my pillow, or the seam line of whatever it is that I'm piping, whether it's piping is great for upholstery projects, home dec, like pillows. It's great for stuff like purses too. It just adds a little pop of a little professional detail, a little pop of color if you've chosen a colorful fabric. So it's a great detail for that. So I like to lay it down on whatever edge I'm piping and then baste it again, so that then when I get my final layers together, when I'm sewing my layers together, I'm not worrying about that piping inside and making sure that all of my edges are even. I know it's basted in and it's there. I don't have to worry about it at all. And I use just my regular zipper foot to make my piping, because you want to get your needle close to this cord, and that can be a little bit challenging because the cord has some loft to it, especially if you're using a thick cord like this. So to get your foot and then your needle close enough to that cord to baste close-ish to the cord, I use my zipper foot, and then I bump my needle over as far as I can without hitting the foot to get as close as possible to that cord. And then it's the same thing when you're basting it onto your layer, and it's the same thing when you're attaching the final layers together. You want to get your needle as close as you can to that cord. And I use a matching thread, a thread that matches the bias tape that I've wrapped my piping in, so that when my final layers are stitched together, if for some reason either of my previous basting lines shows from the right side, it won't be super glaring. And then it's a basting stitch, so it's, a long stitch, so it'll be easy to pull out if I for some reason decide that I don't want those stitches showing on the right side. It's easy to pull out, but like I said, if it's matching, you're really not going to see it anyway. So piping, that's the crash course on piping. They do make, let me say real quick, they do make piping feet, which have a little groove on the underside, so you can clip that on, and the filler cord of the piping will run right under the foot. So you can get really close, your needle can get really close to the cord using a foot like that, but it's best for real thin cord like this. It wouldn't work for a thick cord like this because the groove on the underside is only small like this. So that's an option, but totally not necessary for making your own piping because like I said, I just use my zipper foot. And if you have a narrow zipper foot, that's even better because it allows you to get even closer to the cord.
Perfect. So I have to say, I wanted to know if you had any other different techniques or ways to do it than the way I've always done it. The only thing that's different is, for one, I will shy away from anything that says basting. I just don't even, I don't even use that word in my sewing room. I don't want to baste. I'll pin anything. But I always use my regular presser foot to make the piping so that my stitching is backed off of the cording a little bit, and then use my zipper foot to attach it. That way there's no worry that you're going to see those stitchings, because I don't like to baste and I don't like to rip things out. So I try to avoid that at all possible. When you mentioned the piping foot, do you know, is there a difference between a piping foot and a cording foot, or are they the same thing and just different? You can call them one or the other?
Good question. They are not the same thing, because I actually slipped up in my video. I said cording foot at first, and I was like, wait, that is not at all what I meant, because they're totally different. The cording foot is for really thin cords to kind of slide into the foot, and it's for almost like a couching technique to lay those cords down on the top of something that you're, doing a decorative, fiber texture on top of or something. Mm-hmm. But the piping foot is what has that groove on the underside to allow the filler cord of the piping to slide underneath it when you are attaching it between the layers of something. So yes, piping and cording can kind of be used interchangeably when we're talking about this. Some people call this cording, some people call it piping. But when you're talking about the feet, the piping foot versus the cording foot, they are for completely different purposes.
Yeah. I mean, it's also confusing because piping is made from a cording, like wrapped in fabric. So since we're on the topic of feet, I see a couple questions come in here real quick, but since we're on the topic of feet, just because we're talking about different feet that have grooves on the bottom, and I think you and I both have the same collection of like 30 plus accessory feet. There is another foot that has more than one groove on the other side. Sometimes it's 3 and 4, and that's usually correct me if I'm wrong, a pin tuck foot, right? So you can have grooves for the pin tucks to go through. So even if you don't have maybe one of those feet that has one groove, but you have this other foot that has multiple grooves, that I hope Nikki's more organized than me and can show you hers. Yes, there's different feet that can be used interchangeably if needed.
Yes, so the piping foot, so this is, it's clear, so I don't know if you can see that's the groove on the bottom. And then this one has two grooves on the bottom so that you can do your piping either way with the seam allowances pointing this way or this way, and let the cord run under the corresponding groove. So 1 groove or 2 grooves, and the pin tuck foot that you were talking, this is a cording foot. It's got all those little holes in it so that the cord can go through and under the foot. So totally different. But yeah, if you have really any foot that has a groove on the underside that will allow that piping to go under, that can work for this. That can help you. This is my pin tuck foot. This one is a 9 groove one. So those grooves are really, really small. So the pin tuck feet that have a ton of grooves might not work great for cording or piping, because the grooves are so small and your piping is going to be at least, an 1/8 inch in diameter. But if you have a pin tuck foot that has only 3 or maybe even 5, depending on how thick your filler cord is, that might work for you as well. Like I said, anything that allows that cord to slide under the foot will help your needle get close to the cord. This is a pin tuck foot with 7 grooves. So even that might be a little too small for the cording, but yeah, any foot that's got a little groove on the underside can be helpful with that, or just use your zipper foot.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, our next question here, Dee asks, what are some of the newest sewing machine or embroidery things for 2021?
The new things for 2021. I don't know.
Same here. I've yet to even start searching things, or I obviously haven't gone to any kind of show or event or anything like that. Yeah. So we'll have to do some searching and see what some of the new cool things are.
I'm not sure what even is the color for the season or the color for the year. I don't know. I don't think it's emerged yet.
I don't think so either, because I have friends on Instagram who always post what the newest Pantone color is. I haven't seen it yet, so I don't know. But if you in the comments or of something that's new and exciting that's coming out this year, I'm sure everyone would love to hear it and see it. So feel free to share that. Cheryl wants to know, Nicki, where did you get the fabric that you were showing for the piping?
My piping fabric. So they're both very similar, just different colors. So this actually, I made this piping with pre-made bias binding. So it was a package of bias binding that I just cut to the size that I wanted it, because bias binding, it's just essentially a long bias strip, which is what you need for piping. So it was probably Wright's brand, but I didn't actually buy it. I inherited this bias binding because my grandmother and my grandmother-in-law were both prolific crafters, seamstresses. So they had a ton of, and they were both hoarders. So they had a ton of supplies that they just loved to purchase and save for a rainy day. And then it got passed down to me. So it's like this cool kind of tie-dye looking fabric. But yeah, it was just a bias binding. And I think a single fold would work really great for piping because you just want a single fold. But I think this stuff was double fold. So I had to I pressed it flat and then I cut off so that it was the right size for my diameter of piping. So yeah, when you're making piping, you can cut your own bias strips, or you can buy some, pre-made bias binding and use it to make your piping. So I'm not sure they make this anymore. It's the point of the story, because it might be from the 60s. I just don't know.
Fair enough. All right. Our next question here, Rose says, hi from Texas. She says, how do I start a small business selling clothes that I made? Any ideas to help me?
Oh, well, that's a great goal. Very motivated of you. So there are a lot of different ways to do it. If you want to have a physical presence or just an online presence, Etsy is a great place to sell things. And it's sort of a pre-made platform for you. And it's really easy to start your own digital storefront on Etsy. And it might be a good way to test the waters too, to see the online market for the clothes that you're making. You can search, for competition and see what tags they're using on their listings to reach your market. But otherwise, I'm not sure because that's not, that's not my area of expertise. But that I do have an Etsy storefront where sometimes I sell things I've made, or I just sell, vintage items from my several grandmother's houses. But Etsy makes it really easy to put up your listings and find your customers. So that would be my recommendation from my limited experience, but there's a whole bunch of different ways you can go about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I second the Etsy thing. I have one as well. They're very, very easy to start up and use. But also being someone who lives in Texas as well, I know that there are lots of little markets and weekend pop-up
Right.
things. And I mean, I live in a very tiny town in Texas, and we still have several. So things like that too can help because you see a customer and you get some sort of immediate feedback from them on, did they like it? Do they have suggestions? So that's always a good way too. It obviously limits your audience to just your local people, but it's always a good, test for things as well. So do a little of
Yeah,
both. Yeah.
definitely.
All right, we have a couple questions about some of the feet that we were showing. Terry asks, what do you use the pin tuck foot for?
Hmm. Thank you for this question, Terry. I love talking about pin tucks. So the pin tuck foot, again, that's this one. And this one. They come with different numbers of grooves on the underside. And the pin tuck foot is for making pin tucks. And you make pin tucks with a twin needle. I make them with a twin needle. There are different ways you can do it, but the easiest way for me is to use a twin needle. So that's, your one shank there with the double needle. And twin needles also come in different sizes. So the size on the twin needle tells you how many millimeters apart the needles are. Focus. There. So 4 millimeters apart that one is a little bit wide for pin tucks. I would use something a little bit smaller for nice, delicate pin tucks. And you can kind of play around with it too. The wider the needles are apart, it's going to pull more fabric, so it's going to make a bigger tuck. So I like just a little tuck. You can use them for like adding kind of gathering or just for like a texturized effect. And it creates this little raised tuck. So the twin needle is used you have to adjust your tension so that the zigzag stitch that forms on the wrong side of the fabric when you're using a twin needle pulls your stitch together, and it pulls the fabric together to make that little tuck. And the foot that you use kind of corresponds with the size of needle that you use. So you want your needle to, when you put it against the grooves, you want your needle to fit nicely into the grooves. And this one is too wide. So I would want to use a little bit of a thinner pin tuck. And the grooves on the underside of this foot are for spacing your pin tuck. So once you create the first pin tuck, then you can either set it right next to it, or you can go set that pin tuck that you just created in any of these grooves to move it, or you can set it against the edge of the foot if you want to space it out a little bit more. So it helps you space those pin tucks out evenly. So you can just keep, moving your foot to create nice, even pin tucks. So it's a really fun way to create a sort of texture on the fabric. And like I said, you can use it to create kind of some shaping. I made a shirt with pin tucks up at the shoulder, instead of putting like a dart in the shoulder, to create, to take it in up here and create fullness down over the chest. The pin tucks pulled the fabric in there, and then that the extra fullness that I had pulled in from the pin tucks, gave me extra room in the chest circumference. So it's fun to play around with. You do have to kind of play around with your tension settings and your stitch length settings to figure out the best settings to pull that pin tuck together. And it works best on lighter weight fabrics. I did pin tucks on a microfiber suede type fabric, which worked really well. But things heavier and crisper than that, it might be a little more difficult to pull that fabric together in a nice delicate pin tuck. So fabric choice will affect it, but yeah, that's what the pin tuck foot is for. Long story short.
No, it's perfect. And I was hoping you would reference the one on the micro suede, ultra suede fabric that we use. So that was, if you were part of this, it happened months ago now, but it was a sewing challenge where we made some garments. And so Nicki made some fun leggings. It was a mood fabric pattern. And I believe the video that you did for us where you actually showed how to do these pin tucks using the twin needle is still on National Sewing Circle. So search that out to find it if you want to know that technique, because someone who has made them both ways, the twin needle is by far easier. It's essentially you're just stitching straight with the twin needle as opposed to folding it and then stitching and then unfolding and creating them the old-fashioned way. So yes, definitely check that video out for a quick and easier way to do pin tucks. Yep. Vaughn asks, will a piping foot work on any size cord?
No. So the piping foot, that groove on the underside is only so big. So this size groove would work great for my, what was it, 1/8 inch diameter cord, because it'll slide right under there. But this 1/4 inch diameter, it was 3/4 inch circumference. So that's like a rope. That is not going to fit under there. Yeah, it's just too bulky. So you do have to kind of be careful of the size of filler cord that you buy if you want to use your piping foot with it, because it'll only accommodate, so big of a diameter of cording.
Perfect. All right. Anne wants to know, she says, teaching myself to quilt on my mom's Kenmore 158. It's a great heavy machine. What's a good machine to upgrade to? She's looking at computerized, basic, nothing overly expensive.
So machine recommendations can be kind of tricky because everybody's got their own brand loyalties or their own direction they're taking their sewing in. So I'm not big on quilting. So the machines that have those quilting features that quilters really love, I'm not, I don't really work on. And I also prefer machines that are a little bit less computerized, like only computerized to the very, very basic minimum. So Ashley, this is the perfect question for you. Do you have any recommendations?
Well, I was going to say, I obviously love the super computerized machine. This one is very, very computerized. But as soon as you add in the computerized aspect of a machine, that ups the price pretty much immediately. So think about that. Price really is what comes into play when you're looking at a machine. But we both have said this before. You and I both started out on Brother machines way back in the day, not computerized, not very fancy, very inexpensive. And we both used them for 10, 15 plus years. So there are a lot of, I can't just say a machine brand and model. It's so hard. So just take into consideration what you want it to do and price. But then when you're mentioning the quilting features, I obviously do a lot of quilting. I sometimes make more quilts than I do garments. And really, when it comes down to piecing, it's straight stitching. So you can buy a 1/4 inch foot and put it on any machine. So don't think you have to get one that says for quilting. Any machine can be used to piece a quilt. So,
yeah. And I will say though that, the first 2 machines I had were Brother machines, and they were like the 2 least expensive Brother machines that they made. And yeah, I used them for many, many, many years. But this bad boy, this is the Hough Passport 2.0, and it has stitched through all the layers that I've ever thrown at it. And it has that cool dual feed foot. So it's the IDT, the integrated dual feed technology.
Yeah.
So it's like a little doohickey on the back of the pressure foot that clips under the foot, and it acts as a walking foot essentially. That's just always there for you to just clip it under, which can be great for quilting, like actual quilting, because it'll help feed your layers at the same rate. So this machine runs $600 or $700, I think, which is can be, it's a little pricey. It can be quite an investment, but I've just been thrilled with this machine. So that's the one that I would always recommend.
Perfect. And I will just to say, I mean, I have the Husqvarna Viking Epic 980Q. So that's another, if you want to look into a computerized machine, this is by far my favorite. Nicki has to do all the figuring out of what she should, use and set her stitch settings to. Mine has an electronic sensor system, and it just, whatever you're sewing, it just automatically adjusts to it. And I don't really have to think about it. So
Yeah.
it's the benefits of computerized.
Mhm.
All right. Our next question, what edging machine do you recommend? Not commercial. I have a small Singer, but it does not produce a fine edging.
Um, Edging. I'm not sure.
I'm
I'm
going to
not
think like finishing off the edge of a fabric, maybe overcasting, something along
Okay.
those lines.
Um, so fine edging. So for edging, like for finishing off edges or seam allowances, I I don't know a machine that would be, specifically good for that.
Right.
But I just use my my zigzag stitch to edge things, or I'll use a rolled hem foot to do a nice fine rolled hem. So yeah, I'm not sure a machine. I know there are tools to get fine edging, like I mentioned, the rolled hem foot. You can get different sizes of that to go on any machine and create a nice fine edge. Um, but yeah, other than that, I'm not sure.
I was looking in you can see me fiddling here, trying to find it. I don't have it, but yeah, I know you have your bag of feet in front of you.
Mhm.
If you can find an overcast foot and show us that. So an overcast foot, because this is what I always use when I'm doing edging on any kind of machine, and it's essentially an open or a wide set, so you can do a zigzag or an overcast stitch, but it has
Like the
a bar.
fin.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
the bar, almost like what you would use for a blind hem, and that bar is when you're stitching, the needle is going to go over it on both sides, and so it actually keeps your fabric from curling up. So I think that's what people shy away from when it comes to that overcast stitching, is like the edges always curl up and they don't look good. But if you use this overcast foot, it holds everything nice, and you'll get a much better edging with it.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. I actually have not used this overcast foot, but yeah, that it has that little flange there for the needle to go over and the thread to go over to kind of space it out. Because I know what you mean when you do that zigzag stitching, especially right near an edge. Sometimes it tends to crinkle up a little
Yeah.
bit. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's a good tool to
See,
use.
yeah, you use your bag of tricks there. Which this is the perfect next question, because I obviously like 3 times now have been searching and can't find the one I'm talking about, and you have all yours. But I guess asks, this leads to the question of, what is the best way to store and easily find your presser feet?
Wow.
I'm
This
gonna
is
leave
my
that one up to you because I can't answer that.
This is my storage solution. It's a Ziploc bag that I just keep in my little sewing basket.
Mhm.
Yeah, all of my feet are together. Um, I do have to kind of search through them a little bit to find what I'm looking for, but at least they're all
Mhm.
together.
Right.
The box that the feet came in when they were shipped to me was this big box, and yeah, it was nice that they each had their own spot, but that just took up way too much space. So everything got just lumped into a bag, and I do have to like dump them all out onto the table and like clink around and to find the one that I want, but I know where they all are, so
That's perfect.
it works for me.
See, in my machine, I was going to try. I thought it was removable. It's not. It has little sections where you can put 5 to 7 feet in the front, and so I keep the ones I use most often. My regular presser foot, my 1/4 inch foot for quilting, a Teflon foot, and then I have another storage area for those things like a cording foot or piping foot, or that you only use, here and there. So.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
All right, Miller asks, do you use magazine boards for fabric storage, or do you have any suggestions or ideas for storing fabric?
I'm not sure what magazine boards are, so.
Well, I saw it on Pinterest once, and it's like those, it's about the size of a magazine, and it's really heavy cardboard, and people will wrap and fold their fabric around it.
Okay. No, I don't use those. But for fabric storage, this is, I know, something that all sewists have in common is, the problem of fabric storage. So I have totes. So, and when I fold my fabric, I fold them up, and instead of putting them flat, so you have layers of your fabric, I put them on the side, and I slide them in like files going into a filing cabinet. So I've got like 2 rows of, filed fabric, and then I do put another layer on top. So if I do need to dig, I just have to take out like 1 layer, and then I can see all of the fabric like on the folded edge. I can see the print, so I know what's what. So I'm not having to, dig through every single bit of folded fabric that I have, trying to find this one specific thing. So yeah, folding and stacking them on the side. This was a Marie Kondo thing that I learned from her, and her organizational tips. But that's been super helpful for me. I've got a bunch of totes of fabric that I organize that way. I organize my clothes that way in my dresser drawers too. It just helps me see everything, so I'm not completely digging through stuff. And I keep my fabric in, they're not clear totes. They're not see-through totes. And I also keep them in a closet to keep them away from UV light, which can damage fibers and, bleach the color out of fabrics. And you want to make sure you're not storing your fabric in a damp, humid place, because that will also very quickly break down your fibers and just make everything less strong and sturdy when you're stitching your seams. So it's my system.
Perfect. It's very good. I should probably get some extra totes. I have shelves built into the closet, so I do kind of the same thing, just in a vertical manner, and it seems to work. But they're overflowing, and things kind of just get shoved in there. But
Yeah.
All right. Sherry says she came in late, so you may have already answered. But why does the fabric for piping have to be cut on the bias?
It's a good question. So for my project that I did the other day, it was a pillow. So I had 4 corners that I had to turn around. So the bias strip that you wrap around your cord or your rope, the bias will allow it to have a little bit of give, a little bit of stretch. If you cut it on the straight grain, it's got absolutely no give. And if you try to curve it around a corner, you're going to get, puckers and pulls. So that bias grain of the fabric of the piping allows it to curve around gentle curves, tight curves, corners, without puckering or pulling. And it's just got that nice give and nice ease to it. If you were just piping one straight edge, you could technically just cut it on the straight grain, especially if you are, running low on fabric and you don't have enough for a bias strip. But if your edge has any kind of curve or corner to it, bias strip is highly recommended to allow that piping and that fabric to curve well and just have enough give so it doesn't pucker and pull and all that. It just lays nicely.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, our next one here, Poppy asks, she says she's having trouble with blanket binding. Can you explain how to get it perfect on both sides without the stitching showing twice? She is so confused.
So blanket binding, is this like quilt binding kind of, just like to stitch and turn it?
I would say, I mean, yeah, because you can do the same technique on a quilt as you can on, say, like a fleece blanket with that, that silk binding stuff that you can buy. So whatever, either way.
Yeah. So to get both sides without the stitching showing. So when I bind the edge of a blanket or a quilt or any edge that I'm binding, really, I stitch the binding to one side of it with all the raw edges aligned, and then wrap that binding around all of the raw edges. And then you can stitch that edge of the binding that you wrapped around. So stitching in the ditch from the side that you stitch the seam on is what I typically do. Stitch in the ditch so the seam ideally won't show on that side. It'll show on the opposite side. But when you stitch in the ditch, it's stitching in that little space where you just created a seam. So it does make a little ditch and you're stitching right in it. So that seam is a little bit hidden. There are times when there's a stitch in the ditch foot, which can help you. But if you don't have one of those, sometimes your stitch can go, up onto the binding or down onto the blanket, and you can see that stitch a little bit. The way to make it the most invisible is when you wrap that binding around to hand stitch from the side that you wrap it to. You can stitch that fold using an invisible stitch with your hand sewing needle and thread. And yes, that takes a very long time, but you put a little bit of your soul into that project, into that quilt or that blanket by just working at it with your hands. So I find hand stitching meditative. Some people do not. There's also invisible thread that you can use, which is it's not thread in the sense that it's fibers wrapped together as we think of as thread. The invisible thread is like, I don't know the construction, if it's nylon or what, but it's like this, it's just like this cord, but it's clear. So you can use that to make your stitches pretty much invisible, so it won't show on the one side. So all depending on how invisible you want it to be and the amount of work that you want to put in, but there are some different ways to do it.
Yep, absolutely. And because we're over halfway through this and I haven't even said this yet, we have a bunch of great videos on, at this point, both National Sewing Circle and National Quilter Circle that are going to cover several of the things that you just addressed. So one, on National Sewing Circle, DJ Humbach shows some of the different types and kinds of invisible thread. Because like you said, it is nylon. There is clear for if you're sewing on, a lighter color, but then they also have invisible thread that's actually, it's smoke. So it's like, it's not black, it's not gray, it's kind of this in between, which is a really great invisible thread for on darker fabrics. And so that video is on National Sewing Circle. Then on our sister site, National Quilter Circle, we have a lot of great videos on binding techniques and on also that invisible hand stitch technique too. So a bunch of great things to watch to get more visuals for everything that Nicki just explained. All right, our next question, why does the stitch skip when using a twin needle? One sews right, but the second one skips stitches.
Oh, strange.
Yeah.
I've never had that happen to me before, but it could be a couple of things. So normally when you get skipped stitches, I would say change your needle because your needle is dull. But when it's a twin needle, both needles should dull at the same rate. So if you got skip stitches with one, you should get skip stitches with the other. So it might not be a dull needle. If it's only happening in one needle, that sounds kind of like a misstep in threading, perhaps, because when you sew or when you thread for the one needle, it's with your normal threading path, but for the other needle, you might have to use a stand for the other spool, or mine has an extra little spool pin on the top. And then you have to thread along the same path, but when you get down toward the needle, you kind of go, at least for mine, I skip the last place where the needle or the thread has to go through and go straight to the needle. And you want to make sure your threads aren't getting twisted up with each other when you're threading. So you kind of have to be careful with those thread paths. So I would say double check that. I would say if after you take the thread out and consult your machine manual to be sure you're threading through all the correct paths for a double needle. If you're still getting skip stitches, you might want to try dusting out all of the tension points on your machine. So all of the places where the thread touches your machine adds tension to it. So especially between the tension discs, that's the place where the most tension gets added, where it's designed for most of the tension to get added. So put your tension discs as far apart as they go. You can take a piece of firmly woven cotton fabric and fold it in half and then floss out between those discs. That'll get all of the lint and debris and dust out of there. That might be adding extra tension to your thread. Just make sure your machine is clean. You can dust out under the throat plate too. That's a good thing to do, like 2-3 times a year, depending on how much you sew and the types of fabrics you sew. If you sew like a lot of flannel, you're going to get a lot of dust and debris. You might need to clean it out a little more often. But that can cause a whole bunch of tension issues. I would say make sure you are using the same type of thread in both needles of your twin needle as well, because if you're using a thicker thread, that can cause tension issues as well. A thicker thread going through a small needle eye can cause skip stitches and all kinds of tension issues. So be sure you're using the same type of thread and the right type of thread for the size of needle eye you are using. And if all else fails, I would say do try a different, try replacing your twin needle. Get a fresh needle, because if one needle hit a pin or something, it could feasibly dull one needle quicker than the other. So you could try that as well, and hopefully one of those things will take care of that issue.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we have about 15-20 minutes left. So if you have any questions you're holding on to, definitely get those in the chat box, and we will continue working our way through those. I also want to tell you that there is a free download today. So it's on the banner on the screen that you are watching this video on, and that is serger techniques. So if you have ever been interested in using your serger, learning more about tips and techniques, we also have videos on that on National Sewing Circle. Nicki and I talk about this all the time about how we don't use our sergers very often, but if you are also someone who hasn't used yours very often and want some more tips on it, be sure to download that free reference there. Our next question here, Roberta asks, do you have a reference library recommending brands of embroidery threads or other tools such as backings for embroidery projects?
I'm not sure about a reference library. National Sewing Circle might have some videos where people talk about different threads, but I'm not sure about one place.
Well, I say we definitely have videos talking about threads, but that's more leaning towards what thread you want to use in terms of construction of something, using different fabric types. The only thing I would recommend for reference library for threads and knowing what sort of backings and stabilizers and things like that to use is that we've done these live events, and we've had a guest, Ellen March. She works with Sulky, and they do a lot of embroidery as well. And I know they have on their website, it's a little tool that you put in like what it is that you're embroidering, and it recommends things for you. So that could be something to check out too. That sort of helps you know what to use with what thread and backing and project and things like that. So that'd be a good one to check out. Deborah asks, do you have any recommendations for organizing machine embroidery designs? She knows there are programs out there. Just want to hear what other people may have had good luck with.
So for machine embroidery designs, I don't do a lot of machine embroider nowadays because I don't have, an embroidery machine. Um, but for organizing your designs, you can create as many folders as you need to keep those files in, and you can organize them in a way that makes sense to you. You can organize them by, monograms or floral designs, or organize them by size, although you
Hmm.
can, change the size of designs to some degree. Um, so I think the best organizational technique um, is one that works for you and one that will make sense to you so that you know where everything is. 'Cause I know you can accumulate some machine embroidery designs and have a huge library of them. So you need to know where they are.
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes if you don't know where they are, you end up with, two of the same because you didn't know you already had it, kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
All right. Michelle wants to know good, easy projects for beginners.
So for beginners, I Ashley and I talk about this sometimes in terms of people asking questions, but also beginner projects for our kids. Because my daughter is 7 and she sees me sewing all the time. She wants to help. So, good projects for beginners is a project that has more or less straight seams, a straight stitch, straight lines that you're cutting, you're not cutting curves or anything. So a good, easy project, a pillowcase is a great place to start. And you can do pillowcases a ton of different ways. You can do the pillowcase for your bed, or you can do, a sham for a throw pillow. And those are all straight lines, straight stitches, and an opportunity for you to choose fun fabric and create something that you can use immediately and show off and get you excited for the next project and for building your skills. So, pillowcases, scarves of various kinds. A circle scarf is actually a really easy project to do. There's a little bit of a technique to the way you put it together to make it into a circle. But that's a really fun project because you can wear it out and somebody will say, "Oh, that's a cute scarf." And then you can say, "Thanks, I made it myself." And then, it's this whole big thing. It's what I love about sewing is just what you can create and something that you can create to enhance the look of your home, or just something fun to wear and you get to wear it and show it off. Um, so circle scarves or other types of scarves are still straight lines, straight stitches. A little tote bag can be a great beginner project as well because it's rectangles. And you can, you don't need to line it. You can, just finish your seam allowances um, and add some handles, and then that's something that you can use as well. Um, National Sewing Circle has a ton of great videos on tips and on and not only tips but full projects. And Sew It All magazine was a great one too that was designed for beginners. And I think on sewitallmag.com and sewitalltv.com they still have some instructions for beginner projects. Straight seams, straight stitches. And I always say one of the most important things when you're just starting out sewing is to start small, start on tightly woven fabric, so not like a really loose slinky fabric, woven fabric, because knit fabrics, while they are fun to wear afterward, they come with some extra considerations for when you're sewing. So don't start on knit fabric. Start on a woven cotton fabric, quilting cotton. There's 85 million different kinds of prints and colors and patterns. That's most of what they have in, Joann Fabrics is the biggest section is quilting cottons. And you can go to quilting stores or other fabric stores, craft stores, and there'll be a huge selection of cotton fabrics. So choose a fabric that is A, easy to work with, so it's your quilting cottons, and B, a fun fabric, something that calls to you. For your first couple of fabrics, don't give yourself a budget. Don't constrain yourself. I mean, do use the Joann coupons, obviously, but you want to use a fabric that just makes you excited and makes you happy and excited to get the project finished so that you can wear it or use it or show off that cute fabric. So don't skimp on your cute fabric, especially for your first couple projects, and ideally not ever, but
Yes. Awesome. I love it. All right. Our next one here, Bonnie asks, when using netting under a skirt area of a child's dress to add puffiness, is it okay to use a heavier netting or should I be using multiple layers of a thinner netting?
That depends. I think it would be fine to use a heavier netting because the crisper the netting, the more it'll puff you out without needing extra layers. I would say if it is really, really crisp, it might be a little bit scratchy against, a kid's skin. So maybe add another layer of fabric to lay against the skin to just keep that netting from rubbing against, a kid's legs. Some of that really thin netting is so thin and fine, it's actually quite comfortable to have against your skin. So if you're using some thinner netting, you probably wouldn't need, another layer to protect skin from getting rubbed on. But if the heavier netting is kind of scratchy, that might be a good idea to just add an extra layer to protect the skin because you want the kid to enjoy wearing the dress and not complain about it scratching her legs. But I think a heavier netting would be fine because I can see how that would add more volume than just a thinner netting. So
Yep. And in terms of, I mean, we're just talking about fabric and pricing of things, have obviously buying less of a heavier one versus more thinner one can help cut down on cost there too. So Debbie wants to know, how do you hem a garment that is knit fabric?
So technically, you don't really need to, so there's that, because knit isn't going to ravel. So you can leave the raw edge raw if you want. That's a look. But if you want that folded up, pressed look with a little bit of top stitching, you can do that with just a straight stitch, depending. So sometimes, the style of the garment doesn't require it to stretch over your body. So if it's a boxy top and the hem doesn't need to stretch over your head, you can just use a straight stitch around that hem. If that hem or that seam still needs to have stretch to it, so if it's a very fitted garment and it's going to need to stretch as you are putting it on or as you are wearing it, if it's very tight fitting, you want that seam, that hem, to have some stretch still built into it. So you can use either a zigzag stitch or you can use a twin needle, which will give you 2 lines of top stitching on the right side, and that zigzag stitch on the wrong side will have stretch to it. So it'll preserve the stretch of that seam. So when you are stitching on knit fabric, sometimes that, especially hems and seams, close to the edge, it can stretch the fabric out a little bit. And then you get that ripply, wavy seam. So sometimes you can press that out, a little bit of steam, and it'll flatten it out. But to prevent that from happening in the first place, you can do a couple things. Decrease the presser foot pressure. So the presser foot isn't smashing so hard down on your knit fabric and stretching it out as it's going under the foot. Or you can use a walking foot or something that helps feed both layers at the same time, to feed all of the fabric through at the same rate. Roller foot, walking foot. There's a foot called the knit foot, which is just a really thin foot. So there's not much area of the foot that's pushing down on the fabric to to hold it and, stretch it as the feed dogs are pulling it. So yeah, those are a couple of tips to, help solve that problem, because I know that's kind of a common thing when sewing knits, hems, collars. You can get those wavy seams. So just a couple tips.
Absolutely. And of course, we have a video on National Sewing Circle. Holly Willis did one on how to do we call it a mock cover stitch using a twin needle, because it looks like, I was looking like the shirt that I'm wearing is hemmed using, the way that if you are wearing a t-shirt, look at the hem, and that's what it is. That's obviously using a cover stitch machine, which you don't have to have. So we do have that video on National Sewing Circle. All right. Our next question here is kind of a fun one that is a technique that I have never heard of before, but Roberta asks about PDF patterns versus using a projector. What are your thoughts on these two modes of accessing patterns? She says she spends a lot of time cutting out and taping patterns together.
I have not heard of using a projector for patterns either. That is very interesting. I'm going to have to look into that after we sign off here. But
yeah,
I do spend a lot of time cutting out and taping patterns together as well, because that's become a huge mode of buying patterns, is these online patterns, especially, I mean, now with the pandemic, things have been closed. People don't want to go shopping. So it's, even bigger. But, with the advent of the internet, it's like, that's, you buy a pattern, you download it
immediately,
yourself, and then, you just have it. So using PDF patterns, some people are leery of it. It can be kind of tricky to make sure, you're taping it together right, and you're, getting everything aligned correctly. And a lot of companies are different, and they do their PDFs differently, but most of them have the little cross hatches in the corner where you can align each next page perfectly. And it requires a lot of tape, and it requires some time, but it just requires a little bit of patience. And then I do recommend, once you get that pattern all taped together, when you go to choose your size and cut out your size, I recommend tracing off your size and keeping that original 30 pages of pattern paper that you just taped together, keep that intact, so that for whatever reason, if you need to go back to it, get a different size, or go back to it so that you can, make alterations in some way, shape, or form, you have that original, and just trace off the size that you think you need and you want to use initially, so that you don't ever have to tape everything back together again. You've got that original to trace off from.
Right. Absolutely. And we actually have, again, a couple videos on National Sewing Circle on how to sort of make your patterns. I don't want to say, I think we call them permanent patterns, but a way it's that they're not going to, especially, say you did still go and buy one at, a fabric store, and it's these big sheets of really flimsy tissue paper, how to make them a little bit more stable so that you don't have to worry about them ripping, or, easier to use them multiple times that way.
Yeah.
Right. We have a couple more here. Maggie says that she has an older Kenmore machine, and she has the same problem often. I get messy, excess tangled thread on the underside of the fabric. Adjusting the tension is not usually helpful. I usually just have to rewind a bobbin to solve it, which is a pain. In my bobbin holder, should the thread go in the hook on the edge of the hole, or does it go loose in the exit hole when it's coming out?
So that last part of the question, I think I understand. So in the hook on the edge of the hole, so I'm envisioning a drop-in, or no, a bobbin with the metal case that then needs to
I'm thinking, yeah. Yes.
In. So from what I remember from using, I haven't used one of those in a long time, but from what I recall, the thread has to slide through a little hook, and then it comes out of the hole in the bobbin case. So machines they're similar in general, but specific machines and models can be different. So if you have a manual, I would reference that just to double check, so you know exactly what way it needs to go, because the thread needs to come off a certain way too, either the right or the left side. It's specific. It needs to come off a certain way. So double check that. If you don't have the manual anymore, you can type it into your search bar, your machine brand, model, bobbin threading. And if you can't find the manual online, a lot of times there are people who have the same machine who will put that on their blog or on message boards. So the internet is, a wealth of information, and you can probably find someone who has a situation similar to yours or has the information that you're looking for. And as to the other part of the question, the thread nest that happens on the underside of your fabric, that can happen either and as you say, adjusting tension isn't helpful. So if it's not an issue that you normally think of as a tension issue where, you change the dial and it helps, it can still be a tension issue. So change your needle. A dull needle is the number one cause of problems. Skip stitches, thread nests, bad tension. If you change your needle, a lot of times that's going to help. The things I was talking about before with cleaning out your machine can help as well, because all of that excess dust and lint not only can gunk up your thread, but creates extra tension on your thread and can cause all kinds of problems. So change your needle, make sure everything is threaded correctly. A lot of times if you're having thread nests on the underside of the fabric, it can be a problem with the needle thread. So what's going on the top thread. So make sure you are threaded correctly with your needle thread as well. Double check your manual for that. And clean out your machine. Make sure you're using the right kind of bobbin, the right size of bobbin for your machine. Bobbins come in different heights. They even come in different circumferences. And if you have a couple of machines, or if you randomly somehow got some different size bobbins floating around in your sewing room, which I know I do, and I don't even have several machines. I just have one, but somehow some of my old bobbins got left or something. So you have to make sure it's the right size bobbin for your machine, and your manual will tell you that as well. What millimeter size your machine takes, because all of those pieces fit together very specifically and allow the needle to go down and your bobbin thread to make that connection. And if something is off a little bit, you can get problems. So hopefully one of those things will help alleviate that issue, because I know that it can be super frustrating. So hopefully that will
Absolutely. Help. Absolutely. All right, we're almost out of time here, but we have one last question that came in, so I want to get to that. And Maria asks, can you mix different fabrics together? For example, like 100% cotton and something with elastic.
Yes, you can, definitely. And it's a fun thing to do too, to marry different fabric types together. You can have like a cotton front of your tank top and a knit back or something. And yeah, definitely it adds some interest to the garment. It can be a functional thing as well, because if you've got a knit section of a garment, then it can stretch around you and be like a closure, so you don't need a zipper or something like that. So yes, you do want to make sure that you are taking the precautions necessary for the most finicky of your two fabrics, or two or more fabrics that you're marrying together. So if you're doing a cotton fabric, a woven fabric, and a knit, you want to do the things that you would do for a knit fabric. So you want to make sure you're using a needle that is designed for knits, which is going to be a ballpoint or a jersey needle or a stretch needle. They all kind of have the same construction and the same purpose. Make sure you're using an all-purpose thread or polyester thread. that thread just has a little bit of give to it instead of 100% cotton thread, which when stretched will immediately snap. And make sure you're taking precautions to make sure that knit fabric doesn't get stretched out as it's going under the needle. So presser foot pressure, if you can adjust it, some machines can't, or walking foot, or some other type of foot, or something to help that fabric slide under, or you can make sure your knit fabric is on bottom against the feed dogs to help that feed through smoothly without getting stretched out.
Absolutely. Perfect. And I'm going to end with saying we have a couple videos on National Sewing Circle. You even did one recently for us where you combine 2 shirts together, a knit and a woven shirt. And so you also share some of those same tips in that. So if you want more detailed description and actually watch her do that, you can check out that video again on National Sewing Circle. And I'm going to end with a fun follow-up from Roberta, which was about the patterns. And she says, AO is made to be printed on a big printer, like at a print shop, but can also be used through a projector. She was curious if we had used it. Can't wait to hear what we discover on it. She's adding a 20 by 21 foot sewing room to her home and would be interested in a projector. I'm very jealous that you get to add that to your home. I think that would be awesome. And I'm going to have to look into this because I was picturing old school projectors like what we used to use in school where they wrote on it. So that's what I was thinking. But this might be something a little more high tech. So I'm pretty excited to look into that. But I want to thank everyone who commented and asked questions. Thank you, Nicki, for answering them all. And we hope to see you all back here next month for another live Q&A.